To this point, we've talked about a single dispute that divides biblical scholars and students on eschatology, whether Israel and the church are to be kept distinct when interpreting prophecy. The question matters. Any position that wants a literal millennial reign of Christ in the future must, to be coherent, argue that the land promises given to Abraham and his descendants are still in effect, and so literal fulfillment is expected. If the church has replaced Israel as the people of God, and if the land promises are now fulfilled via the Great Commission to overspread the earth with God's people, for example, if the church is a kingdom, then no literal millennium would be expected, or so it goes. To be more precise, the ground we've covered thus far has been effectively raised related questions. There are some questions that stem from the Israel and or the church. Are there some questions that stem from Israel and or the church? Yes or no? The problem is not really settled yet. While Galatians 3 explicitly says that the church, Christians, have inherited the promises given to Abraham, does Paul restrict those promises to the promise a seed, descendants, literal and or spiritual, but exclude the land? In other words, since there is no mention of the land in Galatians 3, might that part of the promises still be out there for national Israel? While it makes sense that the Great Commission would translate to fulfilling the land element, the oversweeping of the nations via evangelism to reclaim those lost nations, what are we to think of the fact that there is no verse that makes that explicit connection? And since Paul is clear in Romans chapters 9 through 11 that Israel refers to natural Israelites, Jews, and that Israel also refers to spiritual Israelites, believers, and that all Israel is not Israel, that within national Israel there is a spiritual Israel composed of Jew and Gentile, and that there is this thing called the church, which is made up of both Jew and Gentile, then can we really neatly separate or merge these groups with respect to prophecy? Some would argue yes, others no, and that's a problem. You can make a coherent case in any regard. All we can really say is that for sure, with respect to the New Testament, Paul and other writers do not restrict Israel to only ethnic Israelites. The term now means much more. And the question really comes down to this. Would Paul, or any other New Testament author, say that national Israel has no eschatological future apart from being members in the new spiritual Israel, the church? Are the destinies of the church and national Israel tied together in totality, or can they be tied together mostly? And yet there still be an eschatological future involving national Israel. Again, there's no way we can know for sure. So everyone gets to be humble, or ought to. This is just one reason on a whole list that we're going to go over the next several weeks, when I just cringe when people are utterly captivated by some eschatological position to the exclusion of any other. And they probably don't even know there are any others. I find myself praying and hoping that that person's faith isn't really built on the latest lame prophecy novel or TV prophecy preacher. All of the above takes us into today's topic. The covenants that God made with Abraham and David and the new covenant, Jeremiah 33, 31 to 34, come with conditions for fulfillment. Are these covenants conditional or unconditional? Seasoned people who study prophecy know this question is important, since if these covenants came with conditions, there may have been a chance that they were dissolved or nullified due to Israel not meeting the conditions. The picture looks bleak too, since Israel, all 12 tribes, were exiled. It would be easy to argue that the promises were voided to national Israel and handed over to the church as recipients of fulfillment. The kind of perfect obedience required by the covenants would be fulfilled in and by Jesus. He is the ultimate son of Abraham, the king in David's line, and it was he who sent the Spirit after his resurrection to inhabit the hearts of believers according to the new covenant. It looks pretty tidy, but that would mean that the church has displaced national Israel in its entirety. Israel, frankly, was no longer useful. The servant of Isaiah in chapter 53 is the only place in Isaiah where the servant is a singular person, is actually the representative of the corporate servant in Isaiah. Israel, the rest of the occurrences of servant in Isaiah refer to the nation of Israel. Look it up. Hence, Jesus is everything in all covenants find fulfillment in him, and his body is the church. Again, a very tidy picture, one to make people who like left behind books pretty sullen, since there is no need then for a literal kingdom. And without that, the whole rapture idea doesn't even make it to the table. I hope you see, again, how tenuous the whole framework for this undeniably common view of the end times. It is far from being self-evident. But the other views can't claim absolute certainty either. We'll get to them. For now, let's talk about the conditional versus the unconditional problem. The short answer to my question is yes, the covenants are both conditional and unconditional. Those who believe in a rapture have been taught they are unconditional. That's wrong. Let's just start there. The Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and Genesis 15. For sure, there are unconditional elements in this covenant. God initiates the covenant and its promises. The first 6 verses deal with the promises of descendants. Genesis 15, 7 through 16 deals with the promises of the land. Then God alone passes through the ritually slain and prepared animals sealing the covenant. Genesis 15, 17 through 21. The fulfillment of the covenant's promises therefore depend on Yahweh alone. Case closed, right? No, wrong. While the fulfillment of the promises depend on Yahweh's ability, it is an entirely different question as to who will be on the receiving end of those promises God fulfills. That's where the conditional elements come into play. Put succinctly, receiving the promises depend on the spiritual relationship with God, obedience to his revelation. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, the first passage concerning the covenant with Abraham, we see Abraham obeying what he is told, and he went. After the covenant ceremony of Genesis 15, God reiterates the covenant in Genesis 17:2, but 17:1 lays down a clear condition. Here are the 2 verses together. When Abram was 99 years old, and the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Notice the language of verse 2 is clearly drawn from the covenant of Genesis 12 and 15. But this time there is a clear condition. God goes on in Genesis 17 to repeat all the elements of the original covenant. Then he demands that Abraham and all his household be circumcised. Here's the point. Only Abraham's circumcised descendants, those who obey, are eligible to receive the promises Yahweh will give. Refusal to obey meant you weren't going to be part of the promises. God would make sure the promises got fulfilled, but the person who refused to obey wouldn't be on the receiving end. We see more of this conditionality in Genesis 18. The dual elements are crystal clear. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of earth shall be blessed in him. For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. To summarize all this, God unilaterally committed himself to do certain things he promised to Abraham. But these promises only extend to Abraham's spiritual descendants, those who, like him, would follow God. At first, this was basically operating only with Israel, Abraham's physical seed. Eventually, it expanded to the Gentiles, but the premise was the same, the obedience of faith, as the apostles like to call it. It was necessary to receive the promises. The Abrahamic covenant was both conditional and unconditional. So now the questions. Did national Israel corporately forfeit the promises? Since it is those who believe that inherit the promises. What Paul says in Galatians 3 made perfect sense, but it's at the end of the story. Is the kingdom the church? On what grounds will we look to a national kingdom in Israel in the future? If it isn't because the covenant was unconditionally given to the nation of Israel. Both testaments agree that those who were given the promises were those who believe. It's about the obedience of faith, not nationality. At least that much is clear. So we can stop now with defending a literal millennial on the basis of covenant unconditionality. For that, you need a different argument. This one is dead on arrival.